question that has to come up, and you talked about building a team of super scientists to help solve this problem. One of the things that you're trying to do is to challenge established, well, I mean, really basic stuff, not just philosophy, psychology, geometry, math, even. And yet, the team that you're going to build, these people are coming from traditional math and so forth, and they're bringing that everything that this is being built on, multi-rotors, etc., are all built on that 1 times 1 equals 1 basis. How can you build a solution that's going to sort of expose the world to 1 times 1 equals 2, built on a 1 times 1 equals 1 basis?
Well, the funny thing is, even though humanity multiplies everything as 1 times 1 equaling 1, I ask everybody out there in the universe or on this call to show me one example in nature where an action times an action doesn't have a reaction. And I bet it would beg to differ with what you've said, that everything is built off of it. No, our misinterpretation of how the universe works is built upon everything, nothing having consequences with anything else, because that's what happens when 1 times 1 equals 1. The action and reaction laws are completely abandoned. Conservation energy laws are abandoned. So even with that handicap, we have learned to be able to fly. We've learned to be able to try and gain some understanding how the universe works. But what we have discovered, and with the geometry has proven, beyond an equation, what each one of the geometries that have been patented here, all of these things are geometric proofs, visual proofs of how the universe really behaves. So the 1 times 1 equaling 2 is, to the uninitiated, could be seen as a metaphor for challenging the status quo. But to those who have the calling, the 1 times 1 equaling 2 shows equanimity and the universe, and it opens the door for really being able to understand how all things come together, and ultimately how all things affect everything that comes together. So you don't need to understand that now, but what you do
Yeah,
understand is that the same way they had to challenge the idea of the world being flat, and everyone considered that to be ludicrous, when they challenged it, 1400 years later, Christopher Columbus, climbs on a boat and proves it for everyone, according to mainstream.
hmm.
1 equaling 2, because I asked them, I said, under what conditions? I said it's illogical where the square root of a number added to itself will equal more than that number squared. But that's what happens with the square root of 2. That's what happens with most of the numbers. I was like, how is it that multiplication, if it means to make more and increase a number, how is 1 times 1 equaling 1 part of the multiplication table? Now, I understand that if you're seeing it one time, but we call that once. But the moment that you had that add the times in there, that multiplicative indicator, that means there is more than one. So now each equation is supposed to be balanced. That equal sign is supposed to show that there's a balance between these two numbers over here and a balance on this one over here. What happened to the other one in this equation? He was like, well, tell.
I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid.
People are tired of the old ways. People are turning their neurological chemical reactions from a perceived threat into fuel. It's taken roughly about 25 years, but the prophecy that the Matrix ended with is here. It's real, and people know about your Matrix. Being woke is a follow through of what the Matrix metaphor was trying to explain. People finally get it and can see the code, or better yet, the programming, just like Neo. Factors of one rule removes redundancies in zero. But first, my personal background with math, aka mathematics, is kind of rough at first, but picks up speed later in life. And now math is one of the most important things to me. I didn't really care about school at all coming up, but alternatively, my mom was grooming me to be a genius. She would buy me decks of cards to play matching games, books on card games, where I learned how to play poker, gin rummy, and all of these games. She also bought me chemistry sets, an inventor's book, and some kind of programming device where I programmed the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. I don't know what that device was. But regardless, it has stayed in my mind whether I wanted it to or not for 35 plus years. The same goes for the chemistry set and the inventions book. It all stayed with me. That said, I failed my sixth grade math class, simply because I didn't care about school. I went to summer school to make up the class, and that is when I learned that I was gifted in math, because I knew all of the operations and did the math without any problems at all. But I once again didn't care about school, especially history, because it felt like lies. And that was without outside voices telling me that they actually were lies of omission. It was made even clearer to me when taking the SAT. I got much higher in math than in the other subjects, actually above average compared to other students around me in that state. So much so that I was asked to take a scholarship with New Jersey Institute of Technology, NJIT, if I was able to pass a community college calculus course to get in, which they paid for, actually. NJIT paid for it. And this was all while I was in high school. Which in hindsight was ridiculous to ask, because I hadn't even taken geometry before moving from state to state and all that. And if I get really personal, I have like a story of how my life changed in those very moments, but that can come later. The last personal anecdote I have is my encounter with someone telling me to use the mathematics in the strangest of circumstances, but I typically would call it pretty common. I don't even know who said it, but I've been trying my best to connect with that statement through my actions since. Is it possible that voice gave me a way out of my emotional spiral in that moment? Anyway, this is my latest / best attempt to, if you can see my air quotes, use the mathematics. I said all that to say I have a very interesting relationship with math, and I hope that I can share it well enough to allow someone else to use the mathematics. So let's start with addition. Many of us have a hand, and of the many of us that know what a hand looks like, we are supposed to have 5 digits and a thumb, basically 6 fingers. Okay. That was a useless fact I learned in my biology course covering dominant and recessive genes. Either way, we generally know a hand to have 4 digits and a thumb, right? So there you go. That is adding, basically counting. Now, multiplying is a bit more tricky because in a way it is an abstract concept. Can you multiply the index finger on one hand by the index finger on the other hand? If you want to consider counting groups, maybe that works, where the group is the left index and the count of the group is the right index. But how do we account for cell division on our index finger on a microscopic level mathematically? Can that be mathematically modeled in traditional algebraic math?
I don't think so.
Technically, using our hands, we can only multiply by 2 with 2 hands and up to 5 fingers. So the highest value we can get without using someone else's hands, our feet, or even that genetically recessive invisible finger is 10, where 5 times 2 is equal to 10. If we're all lucky, and didn't lose a finger. Imagine how much we could accomplish if we were able to do math on the cellular level, where 2 organisms join and make a new organism like a skin cell. How would that math work? I would like to explore that. But back to the index finger multiplication. We do it anyway, and just say that our left index times our right index is our left index, correct? It doesn't make any sense to me. So in my opinion, anything multiplied by 1 is pointless, useless, redundant, whatever negative connotation you want to use, simply because you just get the same number back, right? I don't even know why it's on the multiplication table when the actual outside of the table, and then the first row within that table is the same number. Like that is pointless. Like it's just, you can just skip that whole row altogether, in my opinion. But now that we've established what multiplying by 1 actually means, basically nothing in the natural world, we can count on our fingers, where we can count on our fingers, but can't count how cells divide or molecules are created. Let's take a deeper dive into the most abundant component / molecule in the body, dihydrogen monoxide. 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, aka H2O, aka agua, aka water. Within 1 gallon of water can contain a certain amount of dissolved or free-floating hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Similarly, in a second gallon, it can also contain varying amounts of these gases. When these two solutions are combined under specific conditions, room temperature or below, it is theoretically possible for additional water molecules to form from the free hydrogen and oxygen atoms, potentially resulting in a slight increase in the total volume of water, most likely in the microliters realm. And that, I believe, is the basis for volumetric math, where the philosopher Aristotle would say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and Terrence Howard would say,
Like if I said to you, what's 1 times 1? What'd you say? 1? It equals 1? Now, what would Newton say is that? Action times an action. That's a reaction, right? An unbalanced equation. What we need to do is, the first thing in math is you're supposed to have a balanced equation. 1 times 1 equaling 1 is an unbalanced equation. So we need an audit on the Platonic solids, we need an audit on the square root of 2, and we need an audit on action and reaction, or we either got to get rid of, we say 1 times 1 equals 1 and there's no action and reaction. One or the other. You can't have both. And until we make that change, we're in trouble. We're going to be stunted as a species.
to start us off, when do we need to multiply by 1 in algebraic math, except in forced situations where the result wouldn't matter because it's being multiplied by 1? We go to the grocery store and multiply the price of the milk by 1 gallon. Simple and straightforward, right? It should be clear you would not use volumetric math if you're paying for your items in Kroger, Publix, Ralph's, or some other super expensive grocery store when you buy 1 gallon of milk. It shouldn't both multiply the price of the milk by 1 and add $1 to the price as well, right? Here we are with a basic algebraic multiplication table. It's pretty basic, isn't it? So now let's take a look at the algebraic multiplication table, but without the ones. Basically, they're redundant, right? As you can see, it is very possible to write this table without any 1 multiples because of this redundancy. Like, the same number that's on the outside of the table is the same number that's in the first row. So it's redundant. Now, let's take a look at the volumetric multiplication table. Under this new factors of 1 rule, updating all multiples of 1 would not change how arithmetic works fundamentally. And people that say that are being a little hyperbolic, because 2 times 2 is still equal to 4. 4 times 2 is still equal to 8. But now 2 times 1 is equal to 3. And finally, 1 times 1 is equal to 2. And I'll get into how that makes sense, even with like a gallon of milk, or 2 gallons of milk, or 2 gallons of water, or something like that. It's pretty much the same, except now we can account for new molecules that are created in a solution. Going back to the original example, let's say we have 2 gallons of water and we want to combine them into one solution. Now you can say that this is simply an addition operation, but isn't multiplication just repeated addition? Also, in nature, the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts, right? Think of dividing cells or even loose atoms creating new molecules. Bear with me on this. The way I like to look at it is 2 inputs go in and there should be a product of the 2 inputs depending on the operation. With the gallons of water, we're adding to them and also volumetrically multiplying them and producing twice as much water with the possibility of new water molecules included because of the loose hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Now, for the purposes of everyday usage, buying distilled water from the store, it shouldn't matter as much, but when making a new solution that could save lives like saline or salt water, basically, it could benefit humanity to be as precise as possible with the chemicals, medicines, and other life-saving solutions. Even further, in the context of inaccurate spacing around a screw's threads, or a fuselage door plug, Boeing, maybe being more accurate with our math needs more precise and accurate calculators. And those calculators need to be based in a more natural reality. Now, I'm no mathematician, but let's quickly explore the hypothetical scenario where the volumetric multiplication operation is defined such that 1 to the power of 2 is equal to 1 times 1, which is, based on this table, is equal to 2. So if we take the 2 water bottles and then we merge them into a larger water bottle, we essentially have volumetrically multiplied the water, the amount of water that's available. And subsequently, the square root of 2 is equal to 1. Basically, the power is multiple ones being multiplied together, and then the square root is multiple divisions being done together. So essentially, the square root of 2 ends up being 1 because you can divide 2 by 1 twice, meaning you're left over with the value of 1. So here are kind of the base formulas for all of this. The first one, a times 1 is equal to a plus 1, meaning if it's 1 times 1, we basically end up with 2. If it's 3 times 1, we basically end up with 4, based on this first formula. And the next one is a divided by 1 is equal to a minus 1, which is basically the inverse. And because of the basis that we're using, we're not using 0 anymore, because 0, as far as observing, waves, radio waves, or the growth of a tree, or whatever, just nature, observing nature, there's really no time when there's a 0 state, where there's nothing happening. So if we're mapping our mathematics to nature, then basically we won't be dividing 1 by 1, because that would come out to 0 using this equation here. So a divided by 1 is equivalent to a minus 1, and then only when a is not equal to 1. So we're not going with 0 anymore. Next, 1 squared is equal to 1 times 1, which, based on our first formula, is essentially 2. Using the multiplication formula, we have used the multiplication formula for power in the case of 1. And everything else other than any 1 multiples would basically yield 3 squared is still 9. All right, the next formula is The square root of 1, which is basically a division operation where you're saying 1 divided by 1, which is undefined, because if we go back to the division operation, we can see if we say 1 divided by 1, uh, we're failing the test because a can't be equal to 1 here. So we just say that the square root of 1 is undefined. Yeah. And finally, the square root of 2 would just be 1. So on that note, I'd like to hear some feedback on what I got wrong here. Trying to get closer to what's stated inside of the book. On that note, definitely take a look at these equations and let me know if they make sense or if they don't make any sense. Thanks, man.